Welcome to The Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemics. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others. Hey there, welcome to The Flux, where we hear stories from people who have asked what-if questions to better understand the world and learn how data can help tell stories that impact decisions to create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier. Today we're on with Les Craig, who graduated West Point in 2003, spent 30 months deployed in uniform and in government service. With his applied math and computer science background, he applied that to help the warfighter, started a company, got venture backing, and is now at Next Frontier Capital, making decisions on what companies to invest in and who's going to impact the future. Les, great to have you on today.
John, it's such a pleasure to be on. That's the most concise and focused intro I've ever had. Well done, sir.
I had some help by somebody on the podcast to get it done, so appreciate that. As we were talking a little bit beforehand, you mentioned a story that kind of got you into the applied data science, which at the time was not data science. When at West Point, you're doing math and engineering. You had a conversation with a professor in the fall of 2000 being like, hey, I'm doing math, but for my engineering stuff, I might want to do science. How did that conversation go, and what came afterwards?
Yeah, it's pretty funny to go back, and it's crazy. I'm starting to feel pretty old, especially since now my son is looking at service academies. I'm very old, but yeah, 25 years ago, I was declaring a major, and I decided I wanted to pursue math. And at West Point at that time, I think it's still the case. You have to get an engineering minor or field of study. And so I'm talking to my academic advisor, and he was trying to convince me to choose a engineering track where I could double count my electives with the math degree. And I decided I want to do the one engineering track that had no double counts, and that was computer science. And I remember him telling me, wait, Les, why would you want to do that? Like, computer science, that's like for building web pages and things. Like, you're a math guy. And I was like, well, it seems kind of cool, and I'm interested in exploring like ways of intersections of kind of math and computer science. And, lo and behold, I mean, it really was. At the time, they called that ORSA, or Operations Research Statistical Analysis, ORSA. It's a terrible name for a field. It almost reminds me of like a killer whale or something. But ORSA became sexy, became data science. And so, I feel pretty fortunate, graduating in 03 from West Point with applied math, computer science. It was pretty fun to have that kind of behind me and part of the fabric of who I would be, pretty much the rest of my career.
Nice. So after that, you're deployed as a ranger, you're on the ground. What type of data, and I think this is probably a good theme for our podcast today, the type of data that is being used by decision makers impacting on the ground actions. So, let's start with on the ground. What type of information, what type of data were you getting fed? And, what was frustrating about that? What were opportunities that you saw? Let's start there.
Yeah, so keep in mind, so my deployments, first deployment was in 05 to Afghanistan. The deployment where I really started to think a lot about data, and by the way, probably one of the only, Ranger platoon leaders with a data science background back in that era. It's kind of a weird combo. But, when I started thinking about, my first deployment as a Ranger to Baghdad in the summer of 2006, the IED fight was starting to really peak. I was in a task force that was doing pretty high ops tempo. We probably went out on, I don't know, 75, 80 missions over the course of 90 days. And these weren't just like presence patrols. These are literally killer capture missions where you're going after, somebody in the deck of cards that's pretty high up. And what was really frustrating for me is with all of the assets that I could see, with all the collection, with all the things that we were doing, all the special programs, yada, yada, when we would go out, I'd go out with my platoon. These are some of the, supporting some of our nation's greatest assets, tier 1 forces and such. And, it's like, what was our hit rate on those ops. It was like pretty much on that deployment, I think maybe 5 or 6 times out of those 90 days and those 80-ish missions, 5 or 6 times we were in the right place, got the right person, and it was a success. And I'm like, how is it so bad? And granted, like I'm not saying like, oh man, he might say like, oh what a yeah, was Les that bad of a platoon leader, ranger platoon leader? Well, it wasn't 100% of the time when the person was there, we got him, you know? But it was more for me. It was more like what is the fundamental breakdown in terms of the data that's being collected, how it's being analyzed, and how decisions are being made. And the reality is back then, I mean, it's crazy to think this is '06. It was very qualitative, almost 100% qualitative. What's happening? Analysts are writing reports. Okay. Decision makers, planning, S3s, J3s, they're reading those reports. The reports are getting synthesized, usually into some sort of PowerPoint. And granted, there's some technical means and things that people are doing, but the actual decision, do we go or do we no go, or where do we go? Very qualitative decision making based on this like ethereal understanding of what's going on and what the priorities are. Yeah, so that's the other thing too, is like if you do this mission, you can't do that mission. So like what are we going to get tonight? Who are we going to wrap up? And it was very frustrating. To me, I thought like we've got to be able to do better than this.
Uh, I imagine that happens in so many of our Fortune 500 companies. It happens in government still. Um, so after that experience, you're then kind of in more of like the decision maker role and like
Mhm.
helping use data to help drive some insights. What was it that you were able to work on in an applied sense, and how did that kind of shift
Yeah.
some of those guys on the ground were working?
Yeah, so I decided to get out. I had a lot of life situation going on as well. You know, my son was a brand new baby. I was a brand new husband. And so in a lot of ways there was that motivation, but also the motivation to do something to impact the warfighter and more quantitative approaches to being effective on the battlefield. I had a really cool opportunity for about a year before I got scooped up by the CIA. But for about a year, I was working at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, and I was supporting a team, that was focused on the counter ID fight. Which the original mission of the Joint ID Defeat Organization was basically to defeat the device, which that's like basically countermeasure stuff, electronic countermeasure stuff. Number two, defeat the or protect the warfighter. So that's like all the armoring and all the jammers and all this stuff. And then the third pillar, which was the one that I got involved in, was defeat the network. And what's really interesting about that approach, a network based approach to defeating the ID network, it really satisfies the two primary missions, which are really the goals, like protecting the warfighter, defeating the device. Like that's what we want to do. But defeating the network accomplishes both of those things, right? So if you imagine like the complexity of understanding a human organization, how people are interacting. There's a supply chain involved. There's bomb makers, facilitators. There's people putting IEDs in the ground. I mean, talk about one of the most complex human systems you can imagine, but not too dissimilar from the way corporations function, right? I mean, a lot of similarities and adjacencies there. Although the mission isn't to kill U.S. service members of most of those U.S. companies. But aside from that, there's a lot of similarities. But the complexity of understanding how do we used to have this phrase where we say get left of boom, right? Like get ahead of where the IED is going to be, get ahead of, unraveling the network so that if bombs aren't getting made, then they can't get put into the ground. Or if you can disrupt the people that are putting them in the ground, then they don't ever get there, right? Or if you can disrupt the supply chain, then they can never make them. And so there was a really concerted effort to use some very unique data sets that we had access to build models and to make more quantitative decisions that the warfighter could then operationalize in ways that we could, for lack of details, like truly
Mm-hmm.
defeat this network.
And there was some pretty amazing results from that program after you like wrote it got implemented. I believe there's some curve that you showed me at one point in time
Yeah.
of rate of IEDs going. I think that might be a good thing to even highlight
Yeah.
for folks listening in.
Well, yeah. So what was fascinating about that? And look, please, if you're listening to this, don't think like, I'm not taking any credit for any of this. I was more of a, I ran a small team, I had a small program that I worked on. But there was so many incredible people that were working on this problem set, doing things like applying crime pattern analysis, um, multidimensional scaling stuff, models, geospatial predictive analytics. I built a bunch of products there specifically. Just sort of different types of density mapping and some really unique ways of like templating where caches might be that haven't been found yet. Some really cool stuff that we all worked on together. But what's fascinating, so this thing was getting very serious. This sort of data centric approach in like 2008 when I was there, right after I left service. By 2009, the IED fight in Iraq peaked, and if you look at the slope of IEDs and just the effectiveness, like from 2009 forward, it was just a total decay curve. And once again, I'm not trying to say like, oh, it was all because of us, but like the Moneyball approach to this space certainly contributed significantly to the downfall of an unraveling of the network. And one of my favorite examples of this is like we had a product that was, we were predicting when IEDs were going to go off, where they were going to go off, and in actionable ways, right? And with about 30, it kind of peaked at about 30% accuracy. And the challenge is if you're telling a commander, battalion's battle space commander, hey, tomorrow there's gonna or it was usually windows, like it was like between certain hours of the day, certain days of the week, certain intersections, certain streets, there's going to be an IED somewhere in this. What do you think what behaviorally does that drive? Once people start to believe that you're real, it creates a behavior where there's a commander's like, yeah, the last time they told us that, we didn't believe them, we went there, we got blown up. So it started to create a behavior that then now the predictions become less accurate. But early on, we were hitting at like, close to a 30% rate. And I remember there was a colonel that I was briefing, and he was like, I don't understand why we should be trusting these models. I mean, 30%, I could do better flipping a coin. And I remember I said, sir, you're absolutely right. Like flipping a coin, 50% accuracy would be better, but these are actionable predictions. And if you want me to give you a 100% prediction, I'll give one to you right now. Tomorrow in Baghdad, there will be an IED. And there was, dozens, if not hundreds of IEDs in some days that would be going off in downtown Baghdad. So like you but to create an actionable prediction where you could actually make a decision, we had pretty good sensitivity and
Yeah, I
specificity.
mean that's the challenge that we see all the time. It's the granularity of the insight that you're providing. So
Hmm.
it's like you can act on there is a ID in Baghdad, sure. What level of behavior is that going to shift? Not much.
Right.
But yeah, the more granular you can get, and I mean, that's what we're all up to at Epistemics, getting very granular. And like when you look at the type of granular decision making that investors have to make today, specifically
Mm,
at the early stage, it's like we got 100 companies in the portfolio. One of these is going to be a winner. But
yeah.
like how do you see venture capital, private equity, the challenges of getting
Hmm.
granular with investment decision making? Like it's an imperfect science still.
Yeah.
But like, what do you see? Like, what brings you hope about like, oh yeah, like we can look at some types of data on maybe it's TAM or
Yep.
what's the accelerated growth rate for this type of a market?
Hmm.
From your background, like what things do you think can get applied in the investing space?
Yeah. It's funny. It's a similar challenge to like the analogy of like what we just described, because I would say the earlier a company is in its life cycle and its stage, the more it's like Baghdad back in 2006. Like it's more of a qualitative exercise because there's not a lot of data. So it's more qualitative in that you're betting on a person, a relationship that you have, knowledge that you have, a team. And certainly, and it's qualitative knowledge about a category, about a space, and it's harder to quantify the opportunity and make a more informed decision the earlier that you're going. I think the key really in leveraging data, I think, and AI in decision making as an investor now is I try to use the sort of like the sticky note on the computer that says, "Are you using AI?" When it's possible, like I'm trying to ask myself a framework of questions like, if I'm seeking to underwrite an investment and there's all sorts of things in the thesis that we want to check the box on, which of those things can I leverage AI for? Which of those things is there actually data that exists, and can I get it? And once I know that there's data, yes, I can get it. What are the questions I can ask? And nowadays it's not just asking questions, but it's like, how can I engineer prompts in the most in the most effective way to get me the answers I need to and to help me identify things that maybe I'm not even thinking about or seeing. So that to me, that's like kind of a more technical framework for the earlier stage stuff. I think the challenge still remains though. Like Tam is a great example. I know an incredible founder who's trying to kind of categorize TAMs for more public contracts like government type contracts. And it's really a brilliant approach because it's like, well, that data is public, so let's get it, let's clean it, let's scrape it, let's get it in a format where we can characterize these things with data that is actually real. We know what the government contract is worth, so we can put a pin in it. But then the challenge still becomes just the messiness of structuring it. And then if you can structure it, then the messiness of like querying it. So even in categories where there is structured data and it exists, or you can structure it and clean it in an appropriate way, there's still challenges. And even if you can get all that done, here's another one. Here's another challenge. Things are moving so quickly that it's like Tam today, gone tomorrow. It's like I how do you effectively underwrite, that when things are just when categories are changing so quickly. So unfortunately, I think it's a time right now to be very slow and methodical when it comes to building investment theses. And the advantage that that has is you can lean more into trying to understand data, trying to understand categories, because if you have time, you can do the work.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the, our favorite use cases at Epistemics right now is looking at those rapid changes in the pharmaceutical sense and seeing those changes impact the net present value of an existing drug that's in market, or like, products that are in stage 2, stage 3 that are going to be soon to launch. Market access changes, public policy changes, sentiment changes, uh, pricing. All of these things have an impact on, what the pharma company and what the pharma company's investors care about, which is what's the net present value of this asset. And
Hmm.
it, totally changes the way that you can start looking at data-driven decision making and making it actionable. And sometimes, yeah, it might be like, oh, we're 30%. Um,
Yeah.
but in the two examples you talked about, I would take 30% over, you and the team going out 80, 90 times, having 5 hits. That's kind of like, I guess, in a sales funnel, it's like that's some like BDR numbers to then maybe some SQL numbers that are starting to convert. And it's like, all right, I'm feeling better about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my favorite principles of analyzing population data or like behavioral data, like one of the things I always go back to that I think is just so brilliant is there's this notion of these multiple layers. There's like typically if like you want to understand like some of the behavioral models that we built or some of the predictive models that we built had a temporal layer. Time is a really interesting metric because it has structure naturally. You can measure the periodicity of things. And I've got some great examples of what I mean by that if you want to dive into that. There's a really cool one. But that's number one. Number two, you have geospatial layer. Another, once again, if you know where things are in space, you can measure the geospatial, kind of the movement of things in space. So that's like a very easy thing to measure. And then there's this behavioral layer, which is like a human tendency to do something. And the funny thing about the behavioral layer, and this is the brilliance of like I think a lot of these approaches to understanding complexity, behaviors are best understood, I believe, because I've this is my experience, not from the perspective of what I think this person will do, but from the perspective of what will they not do. In other words, a constraint. Constraints are actually what governs behavior. And there's some really fun examples of that, that too, that we could peel back. But it's sort of like there's a natural order to getting ready in the morning, right? In terms of like, you don't drink the orange juice after you brush your teeth. You don't shave after you take a shower. So it's like there's natural constraints you can say on if you were going to guess like what his morning routine is, right? And it's the constraints that actually drive most of our human behaviors.
So, plus, we probably got time for a few more questions, and there's some that I always love to hit on during these episodes. This one I think is particularly interesting given you and I grew up about a mile and a half away from each other, went to the same middle school, same high school, and shared some, you know, pretty influential people in our lives early on. Um,
Good.
One of the questions every episode that people get asked, like, what got you into math in the first
Mm,
place, or what got you
yeah.
into like trying to like really use data or get into modeling? Like, what was that first tipping point for you?
Yeah, great question. So it's funny when I think back to what it actually was that got me into math, and it's a little bit of I'll like breadcrumb trail here, but it was the Nintendo Entertainment System. NES, Super Mario Brothers, Legend of Zelda, my all-time favorite game. But I had a Nintendo and I loved it. It was like I was so intrigued by that technology and I was like definitely like a 90s kid when it came to like video games and friends and it was the thing. It was a fun hobby. I'll never forget the day. I sold my NES at a garage sale and I bought because I wanted a computer. And I bought a Packard Bell 286. I saved up money, like I sold my Nintendo, bought a Packard Bell 286. And my favorite games on that 286 megahertz computer were simulation games. Football, baseball. Like I loved simulating. I remember my dad used to yell at me because I would do these like we had a dot matrix printer, and it was like I would just waste all the paper and all the ribbons. I was print out all these stats. I was like trading players. And that would lead me even when I was at West Point, I did for one of my thesis projects, I did a simulation of the 1990 Pirates, Pittsburgh Pirates baseball, and should they have gone to the World Series and beaten the Braves. And anyway, so like I got into it from that strange angle, and so that's part of it. And then the
Oh,
other
so you're
part of it is
saying you were early Moneyball, early data science. Love to hear it. Your portfolio
you
companies
want
are
to know what I'm early
early
on?
on that.
No,
Yeah.
just kidding. So and then it's also so it's experience, but then it's people. And you know this. I mean, we shared a very special person in our life, and I had some incredible math teachers at Cathedral Prep, Roll Ramblers. But one of the most influential was Mrs. Mullen, who taught me AP Math junior and senior year at Cathedral Prep, and that was probably the biggest inspiration, and also the biggest leg up because I also think when you pursue things that you love and enjoy, you get really good at them, and then the better you get at them, the more competitive. I was blowing. I remember I went to West Point for the tour of the academy day, and the teacher threw out a pop quiz to everybody in this calculus class. And kids like cadets are failing it. I'm like the high school kid incoming. I've got 100 on it. And all these cadets are like, "You son of a bitch!" But like that wasn't because of me. That was because of Mrs. Mullen.
Yeah.
And so you get a leg up. You get this passion and
She
pursuit.
would she would absolutely expect that of you too.
Child of grace, yes, she would.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Final question. It's one of the fun questions we ask everybody on here. Um, they say like models are meant to help make decisions and data can help make decisions. If you could go back to any time in your life or any time in history, you get to rewind the clock. Podcast is called The Flux. You're in the flux capacitor. Rev that thing up. We travel back to any point in time, and you get to use data to make a different decision than what was made. What would you go back to? And we call these what the flux moments. Like
Mhm.
this decision was made, that was the outcome. How the heck did that happen? Um, what would you go back to, and what would you try to do differently?
So I'm gonna throw a really this is like a real boomerang. Uh, by the way, all models are wrong. Some are useful. But I'm gonna go back to actually when I decided uh, the decision to go to West Point because I made that for decisions based on incomplete data and things I didn't know and things I thought. And this desire, originally I talk about how I ended up being a math major. I actually went to West Point because it was the cheapest pre-med program in the country. And after my freshman year, I decided I did not want to be an orthopedic surgeon. But for me, the frame of reference in Erie, Pennsylvania was like, if I want to have a great lifestyle, like I want to be a doctor or a lawyer, I don't want to do law. I'm a science math guy. I'm going to
Mhm.
go pre-med. I got into some great, I got into Duke, UPenn, Notre Dame, West Point. West Point was the cheapest option, and I didn't have options. But like, wouldn't it be cool to simulate my life had I gone a different place, a different path? And I'm not saying I would have. I'm not saying I regret it, but I'm just curious. I'm just curious. Like, who would I be now? How would things be different?
Mhm. Mhm. All right, Les, so good to have you on. If people, like your kids are like starting, the search right now.
Yeah.
Um, as you're looking at like what the future of data science and data-driven decision making is going to be, like what advice do you give to, what advice do you give your own kids who are making that decision right now?
Learn how to use AI safely and effectively, and use AI to discover what you're passionate about, what you're good at, and where you have an unfair advantage over others. Because I think if you do that, if you learn how to prompt engineer, you can learn how to do anything with that tool. And it's still in its infancy. I mean, it's like we're gonna look back on this and be like, yeah, remember ChatGPT? That was like punch cards, man. But if you can learn it now, get ahead of it. Like I really think, like I would not encourage people to study computer science. I would not encourage people to study any real liberal arts. I think you just have to be curious. You have to naturally want to learn. You have to naturally want to read. You have to naturally go after the fundamentals. Kind of the reading, writing, arithmetic. Like, be good at the basics, and leverage AI to teach you what your superpower is.
Awesome. Les, thank you so much. This is a great episode. Um, yeah, really enjoyed having you on.
Thanks, John. It was a pleasure.